بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت الحكيم العليم. اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وانزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. It's been a little while. So let's get back in the mix. Today's going to be a light one, inshallah. So hopefully that will help everyone to kind of get back into the groove of things. As you remember, we were right in the middle of Surah Yasin, a little bit more than halfway through, and Surah Yasin is from the early Makki period. So it's a very unique surah because most of the surahs in the Makki period are very short. They only have a singular message. But here you have a very, very well-defined surah with clear, distinct sections, with transitions, with topics, a beginning introduction, and an ending and a conclusion. And so in the previous sessions, we had talked about the introduction. Then there's about 5 sections in Surah Yasin. Then we transition into the past, history and examples. Then we went into the present, and that's we're just concluding today, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives 3 main examples, and that's for people to reflect. Then there's a short section in which Allah mentions people who refuse to think and who refuse to reflect and to refuse to draw conclusions from the natural reality. And then, of course, one of the main sections, which is about the future, and the future is about the afterlife. And when you look at Surah Yasin in totality, it's really talking about the journey of life, because it's talking about the past, the present, and it's talking about the future. So today we're going to cover the third and the last sign. وَآيَةٌ لَهُمْ أَنَّا حَمَلْنَا ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ فِي الْفُلْكِ الْمَشْحُونِ. So what is the laden ship? We'll mention that inshallah. And then Allah mentions, right after mentioning the laden ship, then He mentions about how there are ships other than that. So what is it that He's talking about? So we mentioned how you have the ship of the sea, right? Those are the boats and the ships that we use to traverse great distances over oceans and over seas. But there's also Safinatul Ard. There's also the ship of the earth, and that is the camel. And then Allah also leaves off a reference of other modes of transportation. And this is from the i'jaz of the Qur'an. This is from the miraculous nature, the divine quality of the Qur'an, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alludes to other modes of transportation that do not involve the land and the sea. I hope everybody's following me. So what would that be? The planes. That would be the main one that we would think of, that would come to mind. So it seems to suggest that, and this goes to Surah Al-Mulk, أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا إِلَى الطَّيْرِ فَوْقَهُمْ صَافَّاتٍ وَيَقْبِضْنَ مَا يُمْسِكُهُنَّ إِلَّا الرَّحْمَنُ. So when you look at the birds, when you look at planes, you might draw the conclusion that flying, the aerodynamics that allow a plane to fly, are the default position. We can't imagine the world being any other way. When we look at a ship that's traversing the sea, we might think, well, that's the default position, that boats are supposed to float. But Allah created this quality within the density of the water and the polarity of H2O that allows, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but there's something about water that Allah placed that quality that we would be able to, cross oceans with it. So we might think that the default position is for things not to crash. But in Surah Al-Mulk, Allah says, مَا يُمْسِكُهُنَّ إِلَّا الرَّحْمَنُ. The only thing that causes it to suspend is Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. That means the fact that birds fly, the fact that planes fly, is a rahmah from Allah. And here we see the exact same expression where Allah mentions rahmatan, that it is done as a mercy. That means that the default is for trains and planes and for cars and for boats, for all of them to crash. But Allah is the one, سَخَّرَ لَنَا هَذَا, who is the one that facilitated and made it possible for these modes of transportation to be available to us, for it to be safe for us. So all of that is from Allah's love, that He allowed that to happen. وَمَتَاعًا إِلَىٰ حِينٍ. And that will continue until the day of judgment. Next week, inshallah, we're going to talk about the future events. And it's only going to be about the future. And that begins وَنُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ. Okay? When the trumpet is blown, and as you know, there's a series of trumpet blows, and that starts a chain reaction in which all of the events of the Yawm al-Qiyamah, they start to unfold. But today is really going to focus on one topic, and that's why today is going to be very simple. We'll have lots of time for discussion, inshallah, which is about people who refuse to reflect. Presented with evidence, with logic, with examples, with observable phenomena, but they refuse to draw conclusions. And one of the things that I mentioned when I first started the tafsir program, when we did Surah Yusuf, that Allah mentions in the beginning of the surah and in the end of the surah that in this surah ibratan li'ulil albab. So Allah mentions in the beginning of the story and also in the end that in this story ibratan are lessons. Li'ulil albab, for people who possess a lub. Does anyone know what a lub is? What is the lub? When you have a tree, what is the lub? Which part is the lub? You have a tree, it has layers, it has rings, there's the outer bark, there's the inner core. Which is the lub? You guys were ready to give me the answer until I brought the tree into the mix. It is the kernel, it is the essence, it is the core. The lub of the thing is the hardest part of it. It is the deepest depth of that object. So the lub of the tree is its core. And what is the lub of the human being? It is the heart. Whether we call it the heart or the spirit or the ruh or the intellect or the aql or the mind, we're all talking about one thing, which is the higher level of consciousness. The mahall al-idrak, the place of perception for the human being. Right? And it is actually the heart which perceives. مَا تَعْمَلْ الْأَبْصَارِ. It's not the eyes which become blind, but rather it's al-qulub allati fi as-sudur. It is the hearts which have become blind, and that is within the chest. So Allah says, in it are lessons li'ulil albab, for people who possess that deep perception, people that have a core, people of reflection, people of thinking. But that word ibra in Surah Yusuf, it comes from the word abra, which is a preposition in the Arabic language. Right? So what does abra mean? It's not a trick question this time. It's usually a trick question, not this time. Abra just means across. It means to cross, across the road, so abra, right? Cross the road. So what is the connection between lesson and crossing? That means that intellectually, or academically, I think intellectually would be the best word, you have to cross from point A to point B. You have to move intellectually, you have to move with your mind in order to make a conclusion. No one is going to make it for you. So in the Arabic language, when it says that there is a ibra, it is deeply connected with the word of crossing, because you have to move in your mind from point A to point B to say, oh, that is because of this. That's the reason. That's the cause. So you can't just be a passive consumer of information, of data points, in order to draw lessons and in order to reach conclusions. That's something that you have to engage with. You have to look at it and examine and reflect and say, oh, could it be this? Could it be that? Then you evaluate different options and then you draw a conclusion. Oh, the reason that happened. Why was it that Yusuf was thrown in the well? Why couldn't he learn this a different way? Why was he placed? So actually, because Yusuf was saved, but he wasn't just saved, but the entire people were saved. And then you come up with all of these conclusions that, wow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has weaved a meticulous web in which one action causes a cascade of effects, right? A whole chain reaction of events that is put into motion because Allah Jalla Jalaluhu knows exactly what His decree is. And we are not cognizant of what Allah wants and why He wants it, but we accept it and we understand that there is a divine wisdom in that. So when we think about Surah Yasin, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the people who are refusing to do that, who don't want to examine the evidences, and in fact don't have any response. We mentioned that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّقُوا مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَمَا خَلْفَكُمْ. So Allah invites them, when it's said to them, to be cognizant, to pay attention to what happened. Why can't you learn from what happened to the past nations, what happened to others? Why can't you gain some wisdom from that? And what is going to happen? What's in front of you? Can't you reflect and think about the future events? Do you think that this is just the end of the line? There must be something beyond that. What is the response? وَمَا تَأْتِيهِم مِّنْ آيَةٍ. Drop silence. Pin drop silence. Normally, when there's a conditional statement, وَإِذَا قِيلَ, and when it is sent to them, then blank. They didn't follow me? So normally when there's a conditional statement, if you say to them X, they say Y. In this ayah, it's completely dropped. When it is said to them, then there's nothing. Why is that? Why, when Allah describes the mushrikeen and those who reject the truth, when it is presented to them, when the sound evidence and logic is presented to them, Allah doesn't mention what they say? Why is nothing mentioned? What is it that the disbelievers say? They have nothing to say. They don't have a response. They don't have a response to that. But they do have a response to the next point. So when it has to do with their origin and with their creation, they're dumbfounded. They have nothing to say. But when they're called to action, when they're called to a moral framework, when they're called to abide by values of ethics, then they say, we have to do it. Why us? So why? Because now they're asked to spend on the poor and the needy, right? And of course, Surah Yasin, keep in mind, Surah Yasin has a clear audience. The main audience of Surah Yasin is who? Quraysh, but specifically the disbelievers of Quraysh. That's why Surah Yasin is unique, because most of the Qur'an is directed at believers. The majority of the Qur'an is directed at people who already believe. But not Surah Yasin. You can tell very clearly from the text, from the context, that Allah is talking to disbelievers. That is the main audience. And so they're asking, well, why do we have to take care of our own society? Why is it our job? So it really hits people where it hurts, because people don't want to do the action. They say, well, if we believe in God, so now we have to listen to him. So now they have an aversion to that. Why can't Allah take care of his own business? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala concludes by transitioning when they don't have any response, and the trumpet is blown. But Allah mentions before saying that, he says that when the punishment, so the punishment happens suddenly, right? So in certain verses, فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الطَّامَّةُ الْكُبْرَى فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الصَّاخَّةُ. So it happens, even the sound of the horn, even the sound of the punishment, it comes suddenly. Here Allah mentions that when the punishment comes down, hasn't come down yet, is going to come as sayhatan wahida. It's going to come as a single shaking. It's going to be a single tremor, meaning that the blow will come so unexpectedly. They're going to be busy with their families. They're going to be busy mocking the believers. They're going to be in their casual conversations. Their attention is going to be diverted completely away from the reality that is right in front of them. So inshallah, we'll talk about that next time. Let's go through the verses. This is beginning from ayah number 41, inshallah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. حملنا ذريتهم في فلك مشحون وخلقنا مثلهم وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. That was ayah 41 until number 50. Another sign for them is that we carried their ancestors, meaning with Noah, in the fully loaded ark, and created for them similar things to ride in. If we willed, we could drown them. Then no one would respond to their cries, nor would they be rescued, except by mercy from us, allowing them enjoyment for a little while. Still they turn away when it is said to them, beware of what is ahead of you in the hereafter, and what is behind you of destroyed nations, so you may be shown mercy. Whenever a sign comes to them from their Lord, they turn away from it. And when it is said to them, donate from what Allah has provided for you, the disbelievers said to the believers, why should we feed those whom Allah could have fed it if He wanted to? You are clearly astray. And they asked the believers, when will this threat come to pass, if what you say is true? They must be awaiting a single blast, which will seize them while they are entrenched in worldly disputes. Then they will not be able to make a last will, nor can they return to their own people. So the first sign that we're going to tackle is the laden ship, al-fulk al-mashhoon. This is one of the three main signs that Allah mentions in Surah Yasin. So Allah tells us that one of the signs of His might and His power is that He has subjugated the seas to carry ship. And out of all of the ships from the very beginning of existence until now, there is one al-fulk al-mashhoon, the laden ship. And that laden ship, according to most of the mufassireen, that is the ship of Nuh. Why is it important to mention the ship of Nuh? Because we only exist because of that ship. And that ship only existed because Allah subjugated the sea to the laws of nature. So in reality, the only reason that we all exist as people, and we're walking here on earth today, is because boats float. It's that simple. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is causing us to reflect and to think that Allah saved Nuh. He saved the believers. And there were no other descendants from Adam. There were no other people on the face of the earth except for those that were on that ship. And so we are all, in reality, we are descendants of those survivors. And Allah says in ayatul lahum that we bring dhurriyatahum. So Allah mentions dhurriyatahum, their forefathers. So Allah is saying it's as if our forefathers were on the ship. Because they might as well have been on that ship because they're the result of all of the generations that came to pass after that. And it was al-fulk al-mashhoon, the fully laden ship. So what was it filled with? It was filled with luggage, it was filled with people, but it was also filled with animals. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded that there would be two of each in order to perpetuate the continuation of all of creation on earth. وَخَلَقْنَا لَهُم مِّن مِّثْلِهِ مَا يَرْكَبُونَ. And we created for them the like unto which they ride. Min mithlihi. So what does that mean? So Al-Arefin, he says, he narrates from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma that this is the camel. Because the camel is the safina, it is the ship of the land, right? Which they carry goods and on which they ride. And you can imagine for the Arabians listening to this, when they see min mithlihi, they said, well, we don't use ships. How many of the people of Quraysh had ever seen the water in their life? Just consider that. That the majority of people hearing Surah Yasin have never seen the sea, ever. But they say, but we know the ship that we use, and the ship that we use, that's the camel. So then Ibn Abbas, he was saying, do you know what that means, Mithlihi al-Kamu? And then they said, no. He said, this refers to the ships which were made after the ship of Noah. So Ibn Abbas, the others, they said it's the camel, but Ibn Abbas, he said, min mithlihi means all of the ships that have been developed after the ship of Noah. And that those are the ones that are similar, meaning that we continue. And after COVID, I think we really gained a real recognition of the importance of ports. Until now, the ports are still catching up with this huge backlog. That, I mean, what was the main reason for inflation? Inflation reached 8%, core inflation. The top line inflation was even more than that. It was like 11%, I think, was if you include food and if you include fuel, it was over 11%. But normally they don't, they go with the lower number. Why did that happen? Because there were shortages, there were shipping delays, there were additional costs. In my business, the costs of sending things had doubled. But people didn't care because we just needed to get business done. We just needed to get it finished. We've seen in the construction how the material prices have changed in a very short span. It's not because of, yes, there was a shortage of truck drivers, but the main reason was they did not have workers at the ports to unload things off of the ships. And a lot of people in the country, they're like, I didn't even know that we use ships to get things. Every single thing in your house at some point was on a ship from Asia to America. At least 80% of what's in your house, right? And much of what's in your pantry. And that's the reality. All of this is possible. That international trade, that globalization, the globalized world that we live in, all of that is made possible, not because of air transport, because that's cost prohibitive. The global trade would not exist if we had to fly everything in. The cost of jet fuel makes that impossible. But because Allah tajri al-fulku, that al-fulk tajri bi-amri, how the ship, it swims and it flows and it floats by Allah's command. All of that makes it possible. So it's not, don't just look at the ship moving, look at everything else that is made possible by a result of that. So Ibn Abbas, he said, "Min mithlihi ma yarkabun," it's all of the other ships. وَإِنْ نَشَأْ نُغْرِقُهُمْ. And if we will, we can drown them. This is what I mentioned before. That don't think that a crash is something out of the ordinary. Don't assume that things working is the default. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is causing us to suspend our reality and to realize that if Allah willed, the laws of physics could stop right away. That ship would start going. فَلَا صَرِيخَ لَهُمْ. There would be no one that you could shout to, وَلَا هُمْ يُنْقِذُونَ, and there would be no one who would save you. We would completely be drowned in the depths of the darkness in the bottom of the sea. إِلَّا رَحْمَةً. Except unless it be a mercy from us. So that means that by our mercy, we make it easy for you to travel on the land, we make it easy for you to travel on the sea, and we keep you safe إِلَى حِينٍ, until the appointed time. As an enjoyment for a while. And that means until the time which Allah knows. That means until the day of judgment. So during life, Allah facilitates travel on land and sea. But also beware that there will be a time when we won't have those liberties. So when is it that we lose our ability to have movement? One of the first time that we'll experience, yes, it's until there's two qiyamas, right? There's the main Yawm al-Qiyamah, right? The afterlife that we'll face. But in reality, when does our qiyamah begin? As Uthman ibn Affan, death. Uthman ibn Affan, he said, qiyamah begins the day that I die. And that's why Uthman ibn Affan, his beard, he was a very soft man, and he used to weep profusely. And people said, Uthman ibn Affan, we mentioned the hellfire, you don't cry. We mentioned Jannah, you don't cry. But the second that we mention death, the tears start flowing. And then he responded, he said, because my qiyamah is going to begin from the moment that I die. Because that's when the journey starts and I'm not driving it anymore. Right now, we're driving the ship. We're driving, we're in control, we're in the driver's seat. But once we pass, we won't have that freedom of movement. Then we will be driven. وَسِيقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِلَى جَهَنَّمَ زُمَرًا. That the people of the disbelievers, they will be driven into the hellfire. وَسِيقَ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا رَبَّهُمْ إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ زُمَرًا. And the people of righteousness, of taqwa, they will be driven to the gates of paradise in great crowds. Because now you're a passive participant. You're not an active participant. So now we know the last point which I mentioned before related to the ship is that now the ayah leaves a blank, right? About how there are going to be future modes of transportation. And now we know that there are cars, there are trains, there are trucks, there are buses, there are planes. And we might say, oh, this is attributed to human creativity. But the reality is that the human creativity is only possible because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has facilitated it. So don't think that these modes of transportation are thanks to us. The one keeping the ship is Allah. The one keeping the plane in the air is Allah. Our safety and our well-being and our ability to move, all of that is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's number one. Number two is Allah shifts to the misguidance of the idolaters. As I mentioned before, how they persist in misguidance, right? Now that we've completed the three signs, and they don't pay attention to their sins, neither what has happened to them in the past, what they've done in the past, nor what is going to happen to them in the future, or what is going to culminate in the day of judgment. When it is said to them, so now you have these two statements. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّقُوا. When it is said to them, fear what is before you and that which is behind you. So people have different, so what is behind them and what is in front of them? So some people, they said it means their sins. I think this makes the most sense because what is it that they left behind? Those are the things which they cannot retrieve. Those are the things that they can't alter. Those are the a'mal, their actions. And then others, they said, no, it's the opposite. That is Allah's mercy, everything that He's done for them. But in their case, they don't benefit from it. They don't accept it. When people tell them, have taqwa, they remind them of Allah, then they turn away from it. And as I mentioned in the introduction, normally you have a jumla shartiyya, wa idha, and if, then you have an if statement, then you have then, right? So it's the same in logic, if P, then Q, right? So Allah mentions wa idha qila lahum, when it is said to them, and if you say to them, there's no then. And that is because we are completely left hanging. And that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indicating to us, you can't argue with these people because they will leave you hanging. They have no response to that statement. And that takes us to the next one. But when you ask them about spending money and doing something and sacrificing, and by the way, this is the only ayah in the whole of Surah Yasin where Allah tells us to do something. There is no other action, by the way, in Surah Yasin. Also, another unique aspect of Surah Yasin, you know, other verses, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullah, Ya ayyuhalladhina, you know, that Allah says, do this, do that, aqimus salah, establish prayer. None of that. There is not an action in Surah Yasin except for this ayah. It's the only one in which they're asked to do something. It's the only thing that Allah mentioned, and it's not something for Allah, it is something for their own society. Allah is saying, take care of your own people, the weak people within your society. What kind of society are you trying to create? What kind of people are you? What's their response? They say, it's not our job. It's not our responsibility. Shall we feed those who, if Allah willed, He could have fed them? Why does God cause all these bad things to happen? Why is it our job to do this? So it creates a sense of entitlement and a sense of resentment with Allah, the Lord of the universe. Meaning that if Allah wanted to, He could have made them independent. He could have fed them. He could have provided them from provision. So we're just following along with the divine decree, right? In antum illa fi dalalim mubin. That way of thinking is corrupt. They're in plain and manifest error because they are disregarding their responsibility for the situation that Allah places them in. So they completely attribute everything negative to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they absolve themselves of any responsibility with regard to correcting that negativity. And then the last section, the disbelievers thought that the day of resurrection is never going to happen, and this is going to connect with the next session. Allah tells us how the disbelievers thought that the day of judgment is never going to happen. وَيَقُولُونَ مَتَى هَذَا الْوَعْدُ. How many surahs in the Qur'an this expression appears in? They say, مَتَى هَذَا الْوَعْدُ. When is this promise? Is it really going to happen? إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Are you really telling us the truth? You get the level of skepticism is palpable. Allah mentions in another verse, يَسْتَعْجِلُ بِهَا الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهَا وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مُشْفِقُونَ مِنْهَا أَلَا إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فِي السَّاعَةِ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ. One of the interesting things about the Day of Judgment is that believers are mushfiquna minha. The believers, they are fearful about the Day of Judgment. وَيَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّ الْحَقَّ. And they know with certainty that this is indeed the truth, that the Day of Judgment is happening. So they're like, Alhamdulillah, the Day of Judgment hasn't happened yet. That's a good thing. But يَسْتَعْجِلُ بِهَا الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهَا. The people who want to hasten it, the people who are in a rush, saying, well, the Day of Judgment hasn't happened, so it can't possibly be true, those are the disbelievers. Those are the ones that want to make it happen faster. So in fact, it's a rhetorical question when they ask, وَيَقُولُونَ مَتَى هَذَا الْوَعْدُ, that when is this Day of Judgment? It means that they are drawing a conclusion from the fact that it hasn't happened yet. And that doesn't make it any less real. Allah says, مَا يَنظُرُونَ إِلَّا صَيْحَةً وَاحِدَةً. They await only for a single sayha, a single shriek, a single explosion, a single shaking, which will seize them. وَهُمْ يَخِصِّمُونَ. What are they going to do when the shaking comes? They're still going to be disputing. They're going to be having their conversations. They're going to be debating, but they are going to be completely aloof of the greatest reality that they should be paying attention to. So they're only waiting for a single shout, which Allah knows best. That's going to be the trumpet blown. And while the people are going to be busy in the marketplace, they'll be in their work, they'll be arguing, they'll be debating. So when Allah mentions, it's interesting, Allah says, let's take a moment on this point. Allah, what are the people going to be doing when the day of Qiyamah begins? What is the word that's mentioned? وَهُمْ يَخِصِّمُونَ. What does that mean? They will be arguing and debating. It's almost Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mocking human nature, or he's trying to pay us to pay attention to that. That people are arguing. But what are they arguing about? What do you think they're arguing about? They're arguing about, okay, who's going to take out the trash? They're arguing, what do people argue about? About, oh, you missed a deadline by a couple of hours, right? What are they arguing about? Oh, this person on the team did more than the other person. They're arguing about nonsense, right? Let alone what husband and wives argue about. Nobody has figured that out, right? But they're going to be arguing. وَهُمْ يَخِصِّمُونَ. That means that we consume so much energy, so many hours a day. How many brain cells have died because we're worried about nonsense? We're worried about things that don't matter, that we can just let go. And meanwhile, we miss all of the important matters that are of great consequence that really matter. We see that even in parenting, people get so bothered by the smallest things that the kids do, and then meanwhile they're missing opportunities to teach them the most important life lessons that will carry with them for the rest of their life. وَهُمْ يَخِصِّمُونَ. But if we knew that that was going to be the last minute that we had on the earth, what do you think those people would be doing? They would be praying. They would give in charity. They would be hugging each other. They would be kissing each other. They would apologize for all the mistakes that they made. But Allah is poking what happens in reality in their last hour. They're busy doing nothing, debating in conflict, right? And while they're in this state, then Allah commands Israfil to blow into the trumpet. There will be a very long note, and everyone will be dead from the face of the earth. I think we can, there's a trouble, we can just silence it. And then he's going to tilt his head, and every single thing that's on the face of the earth is going to tilt its head and listen to the sound that's coming from the heaven. So it's reported that even everything knows that the trumpet is calling, so it's going to be waiting for the first trumpet to end and the second trumpet for everything up. And the people who are alive, they will all be driven into this mahshar, into this gathering place, and there will be a fire which will be surrounded on all sides, and Allah will say they will not be able to make any bequest. Now, they're not in control of their possessions because things are way more serious, nor will they be able to return to their family. As we mentioned, the trumpet will be blown and everyone will die, illa man sha Allah, except for whom Allah wills. And the only one that's going to be alive, the only one that survives this is al-hayy alladhi la yamut, the one who is al-fard al-samad, who is eternal and who does not die. And then the trumpet blast for the resurrection will be sounded. We'll leave that, inshallah, for our meeting next week. And inshallah, we'll open up for questions or discussion. We have the Zoom open as well, and we're happy to take any questions. Bismillah. Who would like to begin? Yeah, you can take this one.
Argue when the day of judgment is about to come.
Mm-hmm.
To argue when the day of judgment is about to come. It just came to me like, well, it's like arguing about climate change.
Okay.
Right. And it's like, so there we have a warning that there's going to be a big problem, and people are going to be driven from their homes because they won't be able to live by this where they've been living. And you just said, they won't be able to return to their families.
It's a great this is a great question, and it also brings up other topics that I didn't mention. So about the end of times and what they will look like. And I think that the question is a really good one, because in the end of times, the Prophet ﷺ has also alluded to the fact that there will be haraj, there will be senseless violence towards the end of time, that there will be a shortage of resources. There will be a period of great prosperity, and then after that, there'll be a period of a shortage of resources, and that's why Dajjal will be able to flourish. So there are many commentators, many thinkers who said, well, if we look at the chronology, then maybe the crisis that the Prophet ﷺ is alluding to, maybe the periods of strife that the Qur'an is alluding to, that could be climate change. Right? That could be all the negative externalities that's going to happen when we have a globe in which we have overpopulation, a shortage of resources, and also all the negative externalities that associated with warming, ozone, although that's improved, rising water levels, which is probably one of the greatest challenges that are faced. So are those going to be the things that they're fighting about? I think it's a very sound argument.
We already are fighting about them.
But I think, it also brings up another topic, which is denial about reality, because now, I think climate change, it's also been observed, right? So it's no longer something theoretical. And then also there's data behind it. So of course we can debate about the extent of it, whether it's been exaggerated, is it, people can talk about the timeline, but then we have some people who are completely impervious to any discussion or any acknowledgement that there's a climate problem, right? And so isn't that similar to what's happening in Surah Yasin? That if you tell them this, they don't have an answer. If you tell them this, then they come up with this monkey logic that doesn't make any sense. So there are a lot of people like that who are really intelligent people, but because they're so bent on denying something, they won't respond to any logic. So I think that's another aspect, which is that When people have already made their conclusion, it's very, very hard to convince them otherwise. Yeah. Any others?
People are blind here and blind here also.
Mhm.
وما كان أعمى
فهو في الآخرة.
هو في الآخرة الأعمى.
Mhm.
So there one who is blind here is blind there also.
Right.
So there is no difference between that.
So this verse that Dr. Amir mentions, that whoever is in this world blind, then also in the Akhirah, they will also be raised blind. وَأَضَلُّ سَبِيلًا, and the most misguided. So when we talk about blindness in the Quran, we're talking about their lack of perception. So they're in a state of denial. So they're blind. Blind to what? Blind to reality. What is the greatest reality? What is al-haq? What is the truth? That is the reality of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, that Allah is the creator. So because they're blind to that, they will also be raised. They will say, لِمَ حَشَرْتَنِي أَعْمَى وَقَدْ كُنْتُ بَصِيرًا. In Surah Taha, then why did you raise me blind and I was able to see perfectly in this world? قَالَ كَذَلِكَ تَتْكَ آيَاتُنَا. But our signs came to you, the same signs that we mentioned in Surah Yasin. فَنَسِيتَهَا. But you forgot them. So how did they forget something? That means that, as we mentioned in the Jummah khutbah on Friday, that Allah had already told us the truth from the very moment He created us. فَنَسِيتَهَا. So you forgot that reality. فَكَذَلِكَ الْيَوْمَ تُنْسَى. So exactly that way, on this day, you will be raised blind and you will be forgotten because you used to forget.
Thank you.
Jazakallah.
Thank you. Question about the spectrum of belief versus disbelief, because in between there are those that know, but don't do, or that those that don't, that know and just want to wait until the last minute, the procrastinators. And so I'm just curious as to, when we look at the metaphor of disbelievers, where those fit in that are in the middle of the spectrum.
It's a challenging, very challenging question, to be frank. And the reason is, when we're in the spectrum of believers, it's very easy to analyze, because the reality is we're all sinners, right? كل بني آدم خطاء. All of the children of Adam, we're all sinners. وخير الخطائين التوابون. The best of those who sin are those who repent back to Allah. So from a worldly lens, I would look at this person and say, oh, they're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing that. That's a bad person. And that's the lens that I'm using, but alhamdulillah, Allah doesn't use that lens. He looks at humanity bi'ayn al-rafaqa. May Allah do that with us, with the lens of mercy and compassion. So the person might make that mistake, and all we see is the mistake. We don't see the regret afterwards. We don't see how they turn back to Allah and say, wow, I'm really addicted. I can't stop. Oh, Allah, help me. Then the person makes the same mistake. Then they come back to Allah. And the person's faith. So in the observable phenomena, when we're looking on the outside, the outward manifestation, we're like, wow, this person keeps messing up. Their faith must be so weak. But meanwhile, actually, their sinning might be the cause of their ultimate felicity and salvation. Because what ends up happening is, every time they mess up, then they come back to Allah in a state of brokenness, that, oh, Allah, help me to be better. But we can't perceive that. We're only looking at the outward. So in the scale, the spectrum, as you used, which is a good framework, which is that we have the spectrum of believers, and they fall everywhere within that gamut. That's an easy framework to use to analyze. But when we talk about disbelievers, I personally don't think of it as one spectrum, because it's not a quantitative difference, it's a qualitative difference. So to put them within this same spectrum is not going to work. Imam al-Ghazali, he agrees with that. And he writes about this in his book, Faisal al-Tafriqa. I don't think it's translated. Maybe, I don't know there's so much that's available. And Dr. Tariq has referenced this work as well, in which he talks about the various categories of people. So it's different when Allah uses, and I mentioned this in the khutbah, that we translate kafir as disbeliever. but it's not the best translation. In fact, this is a mistranslation because Allah talks about if everyone who's reading the Qur'an is a disbeliever, then Allah could just say, oh, disbelievers. But Allah doesn't say that. Because if you look in a Venn diagram, you have believers, and then you have disbelievers, and then this ocean of people who are non-believers. I hope everybody's following. Disbeliever is an action. That means, kafara means to cover the truth. It means to reject. So rejection is an active process. So somebody who's never heard about Islam cannot be a kafir, right? That person is not a believer. I'm not saying that. But that person is not a kafir. They're in a no man's land, right? Or they have a TBD. Their status is to be determined, right? But we cannot take everyone who's not Muslim and call them kafir. And Muslims have never done that. It's just something that regular Muslims do. But our intellectuals, our scholars, they have never done that because that's an intellectual shortcut, which we shouldn't do. So that means we have believers, we understand that spectrum, we have disbelievers, which is an even easier analysis because whether we like it or not, some people might say, but that person is a good person. I reject that argument. A person who knowingly rejects Allah as their creator, who engages in shirk, who engages in atheism, who denies Allah's existence, has committed the gravest sin that a person can commit against Allah, the Lord of the universe. So there's some Muslims who don't like that. They say, but they're good people. But there can't be anything altruistic about this person. Why do you have to question yourself? Why do you think they're a good person? If they don't believe in an afterlife, they don't believe in God, then they must be seeking pleasure in this world. That means they must try to be a good people for some other reason. Because altruism and having good intentions are because we believe that there is a good consequence to our action. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Otherwise, that person is completely irrational. So that's why as Muslims, we question the premise of that question. Although there are a lot of people who ask it, I personally don't agree with the question. I think it's impossible. So a person who is actually rejected as a kafir, that person has a very clear path. But then there's this whole segment of people who have not experienced, who don't understand, or who are having struggles in faith. Now, among Christians, there are a lot of people who fall within this category. Why? Because unfortunately, in our view as Muslims, their religion is confused, right? So that's why in Surah Al-Fatiha we say, وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, right? Because they have become astray. Now, Allah is going to be more merciful. Right? I want everyone to pay attention to this. He's going to be more merciful and more compassionate and more understanding to a person who's confused about their faith than a person who has knowingly rejected him. Right? And so there is some room for people who are confused. Is it God the Father? Is it God the Son? Like, what am I supposed to say? There are a lot of people like that. They go to prayer and they're like, I don't know what word to use, what God to say, because they haven't studied the Bible, they haven't studied religion. They just repeat whatever they've learned from their parents and society. But inside there's a possibility that they know in a deeper level that there's one God. And this is the one God that created them, and who is the one who can assist them, and who is the one that they should call for help. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. So for those people in that category, yes, I do believe that their actions matter. But their actions matter only because even in their confused faith, they believe in Allah. But for the people who don't believe in Allah, I don't believe that their actions even enter into the equation because they have already exited themselves by their own devices from Allah's grace. And so it no longer is relevant. But for that middle tier of people, it does make a difference because why is it? Allah says that among them, there are people who are qissisin, who are fair, who are just. There are people, rahbaniyah. There are people who have very merciful nature, وَهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, and they don't arrogate themselves. So as Muslims, we shouldn't glorify that. But at the same time, we shouldn't denigrate such people. We should be balanced. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, and He knows how to deal with people who exist in that, who operate within that space, who are neither clear believers. So we shouldn't say, oh, these people are Muslim, because that does a disservice to what the parameters of Iman are. But we should not also denigrate them by saying that, oh, these are kuffar, right? Because their status is more complex than that. And it's not difficult for Allah, right? He's able to parse through things in ways that, we never could. So for those people, I do think that their actions speak to their Iman. May Allah make us people who are alim and amilun, right? So ulama, amilun, so people of knowledge and people also of action.
whom does he refer? الذين كفروا سواء عليهم أنذرتهم. Whom does it?
Right, so in the beginning of the Surah Yasin, where we went through this ayah, the Sawa'un alayhim. So he's talking about Quraysh and he's calling it before he even. So in the introduction, Allah is saying that, okay, we didn't write them or not, and we didn't even get to the verses yet. Allah already calls it, but they're not going to heed this message. Sawa'un alayhim. It's the same whether you warn them and tundirhum. If you don't warn them, they're never going to believe, right? And isn't that the case? How many of the Quraysh, how many of them died in a state of kufr and they rejected it and they never became believers? So part of it is a threat. Part of it is a threat to Quraysh because they're the audience, and part of it is Allah reassuring the Prophet. فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ. You might overwhelm yourself. لَا يَكُونُ مُؤْمِنِينَ. So the Prophet, he's so distressed, he's weeping, he's overwhelmed with this duty and responsibility that my people are not believing in me. So Allah is also saying, it's not you, it's not you, it's them. So there's nothing that you could do differently in order to warn them and which they would heed the message. So simultaneously, this is from the beauty of the Qur'an, it's a threat and it's also words of reassurance coming in one ayah. Yeah. Yes, Abdullah.
You mentioned that Surah Yasin is for the disbelievers.
The primary audience.
Or primary audience.
Yeah.
Why we recite it when there's a funeral?
When we
recite Yasin during a funeral.
this is a great question. It's an easy question, inshallah. Surah Yasin is about the journey of life. And when I say that the primary audience is non-believers, it doesn't mean that we are not also the audience. The whole Quran is for the believers. But in that moment, in that time, the primary audience was disbelievers, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite wisdom can make something for the primary audience then and also be for us now. Right? So Allah is able to do both. It's not binary like A or B. It can be A and B. But Surah Yasin tells us about the journey of life. And when you recite Surah Yasin, and we're going to talk about it next Sunday, inshallah, it shows, I know MLK is a holiday, but we still have the Halaqa, I'm pretty sure, next Sunday. So don't, even though it's a holiday week, I know people are traveling. If you're traveling, just join us on Zoom, inshallah. It tells you that life began before the time when you were even born, and it does not end in the time that you die. But there's the afterlife, which is the al-hayat al-abadiyya. That is the eternal life. And for the believer, when you read Surah Yasin, especially when you're mourning a loved one, it leaves you with a sense of reassurance, a knowledge and a recognition that that person has returned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the place where we all belong. So this Muslim practice of reciting Surah Yasin, actually the Prophet said he never said to recite Surah Yasin after somebody dies. He told us to recite Surah Yasin ourselves when we're approaching death. But the practice of reciting it, why? Because it's even more important to remind yourself before you die. But the practice of reciting it after somebody dies is sound and correct. Surah Yasin is a salve for the heart. So we should recite it as much as possible. Alhamdulillah. Yes, Abdul Karim.
On the topic of like what's a believer versus an unbeliever.
This ayah earlier in Surah Yasin always makes me think قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. So the disbelievers here who are denying these prophets, they're saying ما أنزل الرحمن. They're calling Allah ar-Rahman.
Yes. This is interesting. And this is a longer discussion about whether is this specific to Quraysh or would this apply to all people? If it's specific to Quraysh, then it's a reference to the fact that the people of Quraysh don't deny God's existence. And they don't deny that He's the bestower of everything that they have. He's the one that created them and provides for them. He's Ar-Razaq. They didn't deny that. They just deny that they have to worship Him, right? Or that they owe God anything. That was the part that they struggle with. So that's one possible analysis. Another possible analysis is that actually this applies to all disbelievers. That the irony is that they don't deny all of the graces that Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, has given them. They just deny the fact that He's the one that's given it to them. So they don't deny the existence of those gifts, but they deny the bestower of Rahman. So it's like you take the gift, but then you're like, oh, it just came out of nowhere. You get a gift in the mail. So like, well, who sent it? No, nobody sent it. It just came. Right? So there's a bit of irony there that they're accepting the Rahmah. They accept that there's mercy and gifts in the universe. This is Surah Ar-Rahman also talks about this. That they're taking all the benefits, but then they're like, no, I don't really know who sent it. So, well, if there's Rahmah, so then that means there must be Ar-Rahman, the most gracious, who's the one that sent it in the first place. So this is the second way that we could possibly understand it. And that would be more general, and that would apply to all people, not just the Quraysh. So I think this is a good place to stop, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has graced us in so many ways. He's blessed us in the past and in the present and in the future. So we thank Him. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instill in us a fear and a recognition and a hope in His mercy that allows us to be successful in this world as well as in the akhirah. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يقربنا إليك. نسألك بكل اسم هو لك سميت به نفسك أو أنزلته في كتابك أو استأثرت به في علم الغيب عندك أن تجعل القرآن العظيم ربيع قلوبنا ونور صدورنا وجلاء أحزاننا وذهاب همومنا وغمومنا وسائقنا ودليلنا إلى جناتك جنات النعيم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. آمين.